All right, hello. I'm Major John Brooker, and along with Major Wendy Dedman, we are going to talk about Roland Paris's review of 4 books. It's titled Afghanistan, What Went Wrong. He's looking at 4 books. Astrid Surkey's When More Is Less, Afghanistan, A Cultural and Political History by Thomas Barfield, Rajiv Chandrasekharan's Little America, and Bazaar Politics by Noah Coburn. And we're going to tie those in to How to Map Arguments in Political Science by Craig Parsons, as well as The Fragility of Things by William Connolly, and see how they all tie together and what lessons we can learn from that. First, we're going to go look over a world view of things really throughout the whole Afghanistan conflict. Underneath everything that happens in Afghanistan are one of 4 causal mechanisms. The first is structural causal mechanism. Next is psychological. These are the general mechanisms that are common to everybody. Structure, the things around you, the things in the physical world that you can touch, see, feel, that apply to everybody. Psychological also apply to everybody, but it's those things within your brain, those things, those biases, those heuristics that apply to everyone that maybe lead to a suboptimal or irrational outcome. We also have institutional logics, such as the euro, such as our financial systems, our governments, institutions we set up to make things happen and to achieve results. We also have ideational logics. These are religions, things that are key to us as a person, individually, that are not necessarily shared by everybody. Along the top with institutional and structural, those are position-based, where you are. And on the bottom, psychological and ideation, those are interpretation-based. And you can see on the slide with the green how it shifts from dark to light. There's really not one cause that determines everything that happens in the world. It shifts. It can be multiple causes. It can be in the middle. It can be anywhere. But they underlie everything we do and everything that was in Afghanistan. When we went to Afghanistan, one of the focuses is the Afghan people. So you hear this in the news all the time and in the articles, that we need to win the hearts and minds of the Afghan people. And we say that term as if it's one homogenous group that can be won over. And when you read these articles and understand the complexity of things, you realize that's not the case. It's not just one person. There's multiple tribes. And these tribes overlap. These tribes interact. And although they may understand the concept of living in Afghanistan, or even the concept of being an Afghan person, they also have loyalties that are not just to the central government in Afghanistan. It's to the tribes. It's to their regions. In these tribes, there's imbrications, these overlappings of the tribes. And these tribes have different ideational beliefs about religion. They have all different thoughts about the structure of the world in which they live, which are individual to those tribes. But they also may live in different parts of Afghanistan, which is different structurally in how they interact with the world. They may have different financial institutions and the like. And we have to understand that as a starting point. There's also warlords. Even though they are within Afghanistan, the warlords control the tribes, they control allegiances, they control a whole host of things. They may even control the economic situation and the institutions we set up, or the militaries that are set up to achieve a certain goal for a particular tribe. There's also the international community. When we first went to Afghanistan in 2001, the Taliban was the central government that did exist at the time, as far as there was a central government. And they really had just a small interaction with the international community. It was largely insular. Because of that, Al-Qaeda saw that as a place to train and to begin their terrorist operations, or continue the terrorist operations, I should say, throughout the world. After September 11th, the United States and international community realized that that wasn't sustainable. That had to be fixed. So the United States government and the UN went into Afghanistan and drove the Taliban largely out of Afghanistan. Set up a few more institutions. ISAF, the Unified Action Partners within the United States government, and the like. But these systems aren't always they're never static. Although you might be able to take a snapshot in time, these systems are always going to be moving. We also they set up other institutions. The government of the Independent Republic of Afghanistan, the Afghan National Army. And within the government of Afghanistan, you have President Karzai, you have the elites. So you can see they just all overlap. There's not one Afghan people. You have to account for the motivations, the desires, the viewpoints of all these institutions, groups of people, all these things when you're trying to decide how to properly intervene with the environment. And what makes it even more complicated, as I just said, is it's never static. It's always moving. These groups are always interacting with each other in different ways. The ways in which certain scholars have seen these groups interact and the lessons we can learn were set forth in Paris's article. So we're going to go through this article in the 4 books that it describes one by one. Major Dedman's going to go over each one of the books and what the author asserts, as well as some of the criticisms or even points that Paris brings up, and then I will depict it visually.
Okay, so we'll talk about the first book by Sirky, When More is Less. So basically, we'll describe the causal arguments per Parsons, and then briefly describe an intervention, recommended intervention by Connolly. So in this particular book, the principal argument here, we see it as an institutional argument. The reason why we say that is because, as the U.S., we focused on the surge strategy, which set us on a path-dependent strategy. There was a key decision that was made initially to go after the surge, to pursue the surge strategy, which allowed us to miss the window of opportunity to see the world as it was in Afghanistan, the different actors, and thereby created self-reinforcing pressures for an escalation of force. In our path dependence, we also had the international community that acted in a similar manner, the UN, with a social engineering approach. As a result, like I mentioned before, our ideation in the way that we wanted to structure Afghanistan prevented us from seeing all the outliers, all those energetic remainders. So what the author proposes is, for an intervention, we should have done a less intrusive international presence, longer time for reconstruction and change, and negotiations with the militants that would have allowed us to allow a more Afghan-directed order instead of a U.S.-directed order, which went against their self-organization and what they knew.
All right, depicting this visually, what we took from the Sirky article and Paris's discussion of it is that it's really an institutional causation here. We have an institutional causal logic here. There was a point where the United States had a choice as to what to do in Afghanistan. Then that choice was, what do we do? Who do we go after? What is, not necessarily our enemy, but lack of a better term, who do we eliminate? So we could have eliminated just Al-Qaeda. That was pretty much given that we were going to destroy Al-Qaeda after September 11th. There wasn't really any international pressure that was a bad decision. It was pretty clear from the structural situation at the time that we were going to destroy Al-Qaeda. But the question is, what do we do with the Taliban? Do we eliminate the Taliban? And whether or not to do that was not clear. There was structural indeterminacy. There were several potential courses of action that seemed rational at the time, because under a structural causation, it assumes a rational actor. So when there's a loose structural situation where it's not really clear what is the right thing to do, you can pick one of several options. You may pick it because of your ideational beliefs, your irrational ideational beliefs. Something appears rational at the time, but based on other reasons that are not universal, that are individual to you, you pick a certain course of action. The United States chose to eliminate the Taliban, which at the time was a structurally unpredictable thing. It seemed rational at the time to the United States, and many argue that it was rational at the time. But because of that, we set up certain systems. When you make your decision on what to do, in this case, according to the author, you're going to set, and then applying it to Parsons, certain institutions are going to be set up because of that decision. To eliminate the Taliban, we're going to set up certain institutions to be able to eliminate the Taliban. If we would have chosen just to destroy Al-Qaeda, we would have had an unknown result, but we would have set up certain institutions just to destroy Al-Qaeda, or modified the institutions in country at the time just to do that. But because we chose to eliminate the Taliban, we set up two specific institutions. And this is an oversimplification because these institutions have institutions that feed into them. ISAF, these are forces from multiple different nations. So this is an oversimplification, but it's done to illustrate the point. We have ISAF. We also have the International Peace-Building Regime. And they're both there to eliminate the Taliban and to fill the void once the Taliban is gone. The International Peace-Building Regime had certain goals. They had social engineering beliefs. They thought they could do good for Afghanistan, and they had a strong belief in social engineering, which created a rentier state, as we'll see, according to many authors, and to this author in particular. Also, ISAF was there to actually destroy the Taliban militarily. But what happens? When you establish these institutions, they're going to interact with all these other open systems. If you remember my prior slide, which was in itself a simplification of all the open systems in the world. Remember, the Afghan people are not just a homogenous people. They are a people that are laid within all these open systems caused by all these different causations. And when you have these institutions interact with the open systems within Afghanistan and the world, there's going to be conflicts. And those conflicts, according to Surkey, cause the institutions designed to eliminate the Taliban to grow. They're going to continue to grow because the problems ISAF felt, there's military setbacks. How do you answer military setbacks? With more forces. ISAF is going to grow. The International Peace-Building Regime has interactions with the other open systems within Afghanistan and within the world. Setbacks, we're going to grow. So once a decision was made to eliminate the Taliban, there's a path-dependent consequence. You're going to set up the institutions necessary, and they're going to continue to grow and escalate because of self-reinforcing principles, self-reinforcing causes because of that institution that was set up in the first place. And because of that, the choice in the beginning should have been not to eliminate the Taliban. According to that, because you have this path-dependent institutional cause that will cause these institutions to grow and then a suboptimal result to occur. There are some criticisms to this approach that Paris brings up. Paris brings up, first of all, what about the fact that President Obama and the current administration have decided to reduce our force in Afghanistan? If it truly was an institutional causal logic that these institutions are going to grow no matter what because of the decision, which at one point we weren't sure what to do, how do you explain when we don't grow institutions? Then also you look at other causes throughout the world, El Salvador and some of the others where we did not grow, or Bosnia where maybe there was a growth at first but ultimately there was a reduction in the size of force. What's the answer to that? Paris brings up that Surkey in her article brings up a criticism of small N research, that there aren't enough situations to understand this fully. But then Paris says, but Surkey is looking at only one situation when building an institutional causal logic within this scenario. So Paris just is raising these issues. The way we read it is Paris isn't criticizing Surkey. In fact, he's very praiseworthy of her analysis and says it's worth looking into, but brings up these criticisms so you can see it from a different standpoint. So the independent variable here is our choice to intervene, and really how so? And it's eliminating the Taliban, and the dependent variable was less security and prosperity within Afghanistan because of this institutional causal logic.
So we'll discuss Thomas Barfield focusing on those institutions that were created as a result of the surge. Thomas Barfield analyzes why did the U.S. invasion fail to bring stability in Afghanistan. And the principal argument that he makes is an ideational on why that strategy failed. He talks about over-centralized and underfunded government as the primary reason why the initial U.S. invasion failed. He talks about the furniture of the world as the Afghans see it versus how the United States sees the Afghan furniture of the world to be. So our view is from our perspective on how we think the Afghans see the furniture of the world versus on the actual furniture of the world as the Afghans see it on the ground. So the argument is that the U.S. and the coalition had very little understanding of what that culture was and how the Afghan populace actually, the natural preferred system that they utilize for self-governance. As a result, because of our lack of understanding, the unintended consequences were that we created winners and losers. So we further created a rift that existed, exacerbating the problem of instability. So Barfield argues that proposed intervention in Afghanistan is more successful when a balance has existed between the central authority and the regional and local government as it is seen by the local populace, as it is recognized by the local populace, instead of the international strategy that we try to use in creating that centralized government that dominated those tribal and regional leaders at that level.
Okay, looking at Barfield visually, we actually will take a snapshot. Once again, I'm going to give a caveat that this is overly simplified. If you look at the bullet or the block, the oval that says Afghanistan, remember there's all those open systems that are overlapping and interacting continually and continually moving. But for simplification, for illustrative purposes here, we have Afghanistan, and the Taliban is the closest thing to a central government in Afghanistan at the time, and they actually exerted quite a bit of control over Kabul and many of the other areas. They also harbored Al-Qaeda. So that's where we were, and the interveners within the United States and world community were not in Afghanistan at the time, in the early part of 2011, prior to September 11th. Starting in October of 2001, the interveners move into Afghanistan in the fall of 2001 and kick the Taliban out. Barfield says that there is a initial spark here. There is a, as Connolly would say, noise. There is an energetic remainder from this interaction that the interveners could have used to set up a system of governance that would have helped Afghanistan much, much more than the one that was set up. This goodwill, however, is fleeting. It's there when you first move in, you kick out the Taliban, which were unpopular within Afghanistan and many areas of Afghanistan, and you should use that goodwill to create the friction in Afghanistan, to break up the systems, or really, better said, to align them towards your goals. And you have that ability at first with goodwill, but it is going to be fleeting. And many criticisms of Iraq say that as well. That when we first moved into Iraq, we had this goodwill that we could have capitalized upon, but we chose not to do so for various reasons, and that opportunity was gone. What we did was attempt to set up a government of the Independent Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, a strong centralized government, overarching government that would do a lot of things for the population. And as Major Dedman said, that's for ideological reasons. We believe that is the best system of government, and we didn't even include the Taliban at some of the negotiations and many key Afghan players on how things should work in Afghanistan after the Taliban was kicked out. We did not have a good understanding of this country, which had been governed reasonably well if you look at history. It's not ungovernable. You can govern Afghanistan if you just understand how it works there. You understand the furniture of Afghanistan. You understand those open systems. And when it comes to a system of governance that works, what had worked in the past was a system of governance focused on regional, local, and tribal governments. Really a republic in that we have local systems and then a smaller centralized government that's focused mainly on security and development. The central government is important. It should be there. It should secure the country and aid in development. But the daily politics, the daily governance should happen at the lower level, because in history that is what worked. And if you understand the furniture of Afghanistan, you would have seen that would have worked, but we blew it. Because when we intervened, we tried to set up that central government that was too big instead of understanding this and setting up, using the goodwill to set up these systems. If we would have done that, there would have been a higher chance of greater security and prosperity.
So focusing again on that surge in creating that big organization. In Little America, we talk about surging to nowhere, not having a defined strategy or focusing too much on a specific strategy. The book, the principal argument here is both institutional and ideational, we believe. The reason why we state this is because the book talks about, how the U.S. policy was so fascinated with the coin approach to Afghanistan, that we were on this path dependence, this allegiance to the institution, the coin doctrine, as we see it here in this book, even when it doesn't work. And not speaking specifically that it doesn't work across the board, but that it needs to be tailored by region to see where it works in a region, where it works in a specific town or village. One of the interesting arguments and comments that was made by one of the Marine generals on the ground when talking about the surges, he made a comment that stated, you can surge troops, but you can't surge trust. So again, we see how even though he understood that surge was not entirely working in this region, we still went with the surge strategy because we were so dependent on this path that we had established with the coin strategy. Again, the book also talks about how we set up these institutions as the U.S., the FOBs, the one-year deployments, that prevent how we see what we're doing, the actions on the ground, and the effects that it has on not only on the populace, but also on the structures that we have created. And then another thing that the author brings up is the use of intelligence proxies. Instead of getting out, talking to the populace, that we use these intelligence proxies and networks to understand fundamental questions that would be answered with human interaction. One of the things that the Little America book brings up is a 1950s project that was developed in Helmand River Valley, talking about the same mistakes that we made at that time that we're repeating again, establishing this Little America bubble, trying to enforce a strategy that didn't necessarily work, but because we had put so much resources, funding, and so much effort in that area that we failed to see how our effects were being recorded and how they were being seen by the people on the ground. Okay, and in the following book, Bazaar Politics, the author makes a structural ideational argument. Basically, what this is a study about a town in Salif in Afghanistan, right outside of Bagram, in which the community self-organized to develop a structure in the town that basically prevented any type of Taliban intervention in that town. And the purpose of the book is to investigate why that stability was created when there was no U.S. intervention. And the reason behind that is because as the actors in this town self-organized based on their structural and ideational decisions, they determined who the power brokers were in that town. So when looking at, how the self-organization came to be, the governor and the police officers in this town were the least influential. So the author talks about, how U.S. coalition and IGOs, NGOs intervenes with the systems in these towns, and how we fail to understand who the actual power brokers are, and how they interact with these open systems. And so as a result, instead of doing an experimental intervention where you act and then you take a step back to see how those interventions are affecting the people on the ground, we instead take tactical actions. The tactical actions that we took, for instance, in this town was to talk to the governor and the police, provide the resources to establish programs that were not effective because we failed to understand how the culture of that town did not permit for the male, because of their female male roles, to actually utilize the resources. So we built this facility that was not being used by the females in the town, and the reason behind that was because of the cultural that did not allow for the females to actually take on that role to be able to use this facility. But because we're so focused on MOPs versus MOEs, we said, check the block. We provided the resources. We're creating a method of employment, but we didn't see that it wasn't actually working. So Connolly argues that in order for us to intervene, either as a coalition, as the U.S., NGOs, we have to understand how the populace sees the things that they need, how they self-organize, so that we can see where is the opportunities for us to interact and provide the proper approach.
So the visual depiction here is of Chandrasekhar and Ann Coburn. And I'm sorry. Did you want to go over the lessons learned first?
I'll talk just briefly about just the commonalities that we see among the 4 books, just very briefly, and then you'll see a visual depiction. Basically, what Paris argues is that there's a disconnect between the policy frameworks and the political realities of Afghanistan. The common themes, again, our strategy is very military-centric, and it's very limited in scope, and it does not include a continuous assessment of what is going on the ground as far as, after we intervene, what the actual effects are. That we're just moving along this path based on the cycle of deployments, based on the units changing in and out, with a lack of understanding of the furniture of the world based on how systems interact at the local level in Afghanistan, and how the people of Afghanistan see themselves versus how we, the United States, sees the local populace and the political systems in Afghanistan. One of the many arguments is that we're applying intervention, quick fixes versus experimental intervention. Again, with short terms, taking short actions without seeing the long-term effects, or without accounting for a long-term strategy. And again, focusing on MOEs versus MOPs to measure success. Focusing more on effectiveness versus performance could have a great impact on our actions in Afghanistan. And then having a plan beyond transition.
All right, now I'll do the visual depiction, which is for Chandrasekhar and Ann Coburn, and it illustrates the points we've been talking about. If you look at orient you to my slide here, once again we have a depiction of all the open systems that are present. On the right is Istalif, which is what we were talking about, it's Bazaar politics. And that's by Coburn. And on the left is really the systems in Chandrasekharan's Little America. And that's depicted Helmand and Istalif. So this is really some of the systems in Istalif, and on the left are some of the systems in Helmand. But look first at the bottom. Both articles talk about how the institutions we set up, such as living on FOBs, and having 12 months when we transition of authority after 12 months, those can create suboptimal results. Because on the slide, if we start on a fob, we kind of go towards the right and we implement coin or our other strategies. And really, if you think about it on the ground, that commander on the ground, that soldier on the ground, goes home at night to a fob. During the day or even at night, because a lot of night operations, they are implementing coin and other strategies with the goal of getting home after 12 months, because that's when they're going to go home. No matter what the situation is, generally they're going to go home after 12 months. And there are strategies there, but they're just not really oriented towards the political objectives in the proper way. They are oriented to them in some degree. There is planning. It's not that this is done in a vacuum. But understand that when you do these strategies as they're currently constituted, what is effective is often viewed by a measure of performance, not a measure of effectiveness. And Istalif was a perfect example I'll talk about in just a minute. But we should focus on, from the captain level commander to every soldier, the strategic corporal is on these political objectives. And the strategic thinkers and the planners and really the command, every soldier should be trying to pull these open systems, these people, towards the political objective. Everyone needs to understand the political objective, and the strategies need to drive towards that. They do to a degree, even as we did with coin and the like. There are a lot of good things that happen, but we can do better. What we have to focus on, or what we should focus on, is measures of effectiveness. Are what we do, are the actions we take, those experimental interventions that Major Dedman was talking about, if we take them in the proper way, we can move these open systems and these people towards our political objective and away from the enemy's political objective. We may not actually achieve our political objective completely with all of our forces there. But if you see the black line with arrows on both sides, that's a line that represents American international redeployment. If you think about if we train the host nation army and we set up the proper institutions where the political objective can be achieved without our military presence, that may be ideal. But instead of just focusing on this bottom arrow towards a continual TOA, we should focus on moving these open systems towards our political objective. And as you can see, these systems are imbricated. They overlap. There's just not one thing. A good example is from the Istalif case. If you look at a map of Istalif, it's off of one of the main roads. And what our soldiers would do is oftentimes, in aid organizations, they would drive up to Istalif, they would interact with the district government or police, the face of the central government, and never understand the fabric of the town, those open systems within that town. And if you look on the diagram, the least influential people and institutions and systems within Istalif were the district government and the police. So even if you move the district government and police a little bit, you're not going to really have any impact on the town. So we have to understand the town. And experimental intervention, you can see the purple explosion block. That's what we tried to create, the noise, the energetic remainders, the movement of these systems towards our political objective. But if you don't understand how the systems interrelate as best you can, it's not going to work nearly as well. You can't create your own energetic remainders as much as you would like to do. So here, we talked to the district government and police, and it didn't work. We learned that Istalif's a pottery town. They make a lot of pottery. Maybe they could use an updated kiln. So the aid organizations provide a kiln to Istalif. And it sat there unused because, as Major Dedman said, they didn't understand that women, per their culture, per their systems, were not allowed to use the kiln. Only the men could. So the kiln sat unused. And if you talk to the group that provided the kiln, they weren't too concerned about that because they were looking at measures of performance, not measures of effectiveness. But if you look at measures of effectiveness and you understand how this system is set up, you can find where those places are, where those energetic remainders, where that noise is, where you can create a resonance machine to move the systems where you want to go. So if we understand where the red explosion is if we understand that maybe we should influence the leaders, which can influence the merchant class, which would also influence the pottery guilds. And we apply force, pressure, we apply our energy to that point. You can move those systems towards your political objective and move those people. You can, for lack of a better term, win their hearts and minds. And it's little by little. It's not one necessary act all the time. It doesn't just have to be there. There's leaders within the religious community. In the small places where you can apply pressure, bit by bit, can move these organizations to where you want to go. And ultimately, you may have the police and district government get larger and have more of an effect. But you have to understand the furniture of the world in that location. The same thing, and then ultimately, if you can, you are going to move the whole group. But it's not just you. Remember, enemy forces are going to be working on this town as well. And they're going to be influencing the pottery guilds. And they may pull the pottery guilds toward their objective. And this is our hypothetical. It's not necessarily in all the readings, but it's just applying Connolly to this article. And if that's fine. And those are the battles to fight. Not necessarily fighting the enemy forces toe to toe. When you're trying to get compliance of the population, you have to understand these imbrications. You have to understand how they overlap and interrelate to best apply your force. And then maybe you get the whole people and you have this momentum towards your political objective. If you look at Helmand, the first thing we did when we moved into Helmand is we tried to attack the enemy forces. And we thought that was a point where we could win. Well, the enemy forces have a vote in that, and they just moved away. But notice that doesn't change the population in any way, shape, or form. That doesn't pull them towards our political objective. We also tried a few other things. We tried things with the religious leaders. We tried to intervene with the farm aid. And we tried to create our own noise, our own energetic remainders, our own locations where we could apply pressure to create a resonance machine to move the population towards our objective, towards a stable Afghanistan, a prosperous Afghanistan that does not harbor terrorists. But it's very difficult to do that. It's much better if you look at their situation and you understand the fabric and the furniture as much as you can to see where those places are located. And you do the experimental intervention. And every bit of experimental intervention is not always going to work. It's not easy to do. You don't know the effects. So you try. And here, as you see in the red, maybe you try and it doesn't work. In worst case scenario, they go towards the enemy a little more. But you don't give up. You keep looking at the situation and seeing where the next position might be. And then you apply pressure to that noise, to that energetic remainder, and the resonance machine moves the groups to your political objective. But you can't do that if you don't understand how these forces all interrelate as best you can. You'll never get a complete understanding. That's impossible. But you look at it as best you can and you have better odds of making the whole situation work. And as far as the principle, the warfighting function, the doctrine of mission command, this is where it can be really effective. Because Istalif is not like Helmand. They may share some systems that overlap, but they're different. They're different places. So if you empower commanders at all levels to take a whole view of this situation, not only of their specific area at a company, battalion, brigade level, but even at an ISAF level, you can get a good picture of how all these forces are moving towards your political objective. But the one thing that is common is you can't treat these groups as homogenous. The Afghan people, that is a political construct that is useful in certain situations, but that is not what you should use to apply your power. And that's the lessons we learned from those articles, applying them to Connolly and to Parsons. And that is our presentation. Thank you very much.